Hey, good morning. This is Melany Wilks, the Library Director from the Pioneer Memorial Library. It's October 7th, 2020, and it would be normally our day for our book for lunch at noon, where we would have people come and have lunch with us, and then we would talk about a book. We would have a speaker speak about the book, or I would say something, or have a guest speaker. So I'm just welcoming you to our first book for lunch of the fall season. We've gotten all of our technology and all of our equipment set up. And so I wanted to be the first one to tell you and introduce Zoom for lunch. And we did this because we want you to be able to have lunch and watch this wherever you're at, from a phone, from your computer, from a tablet. You could take it with you and you could watch it with a friend, somebody in your family, or just have time to do it elsewhere. Maybe later on, as we get later on in the season, we'll go better. We can invite a few people to come and sit in the room. But right now, while we're still trying this out, we're doing Zoom for lunch. So today's book is called The Librarian of Auschwitz. It's written by Antonio Iturbe. And he originally heard about a stack of books that were in Auschwitz in Block 31. And it said, and Alberto Mangel in the Library at Night said, at the end of the day, the books, along with other treasures, such as medicines and some food, were entrusted to me, one of the oldest girls, whose task it was to hide them away in different places every night. And Antonio said that hit him really hard. And he wanted to know who that person was. So he went and he found Dita Polochov, and she was Czech. She was originally from Prague, raised in a very loving home. And then from Prague, during the times of the Nazis, she was sent to a ghetto. And then from the ghetto, she was sent to Auschwitz with her mother and father. He originally wrote this book in Spanish. So you'll see this is the Spanish edition. It's been translated in English so you and I can read it and understand it. When he first heard about Dita, he began emailing her. And they probably emailed a couple of years. And then he went to Prague, and she showed him some of the things that she had and what she knew about Auschwitz and her experience. And then she took him to the Terezin ghetto, where her family was there for a time before they went to Auschwitz. After he met with her, he then went and interviewed others and collected sources from them. This is a historical fiction book. It's a story born from her own experiences and rich imagination of the author. I will tell you that there are times that she said that some of it's over-dramatized in the book about Block 31. But I do know that that one of the SS doctor's physicians was Dr. Joseph Mengele, and he is considered one of the most ruthless people in the world during the time of the Nazis. He would kill people, he would perform operations on them. I have read of castrations and twins being operated on and horrific things. So some of this, the author may have put into the book from other documentary pieces of work and things that he's read. He does give you, at the end, primary sources of people he talked to. He also gives you, at the end of the book, what happened to, and some of the people that were mentioned in the book. So he does give some information about it. She is very forthright in saying, though, that the library and her being a librarian did not save her life. She's very pointed about that, and I don't blame her for saying that. But I will say that some of this has been dramatized. He acknowledges that. But I think it's worth our read, because so much of what happened during the time of the Nazis was horrific, and it's probably not too far a stretch to understand what he wrote. So the reason he he did this, he told Vita, he said, everyone knows about the largest library in the world, but I'm going to write a book about the smallest library in the world and its librarian. When I read that, that just really struck me. I was like, wow, that's really inspirational. One person with a few books can make a difference in the world. As a librarian, I believe that. But sometimes people aren't willing to make the next step and risk their lives for things. One of the things about the school that was set up and the library and the librarian, that they called her, was set up, is that it was a way to teach the Jewish children some heritage, some education. There was a gentleman named Freddie Hirsch, and he originally was a athletic director in Prague. And then he went to Terezin ghetto, and there he saw Dita, and she had been helping in the library there. Dita didn't remember this, but Hirsch did. And so when they were looking for assistants in the school, they were looking for someone 14 and a half, 14 years old and above, because anybody below that would be sent to the gas chambers. She was of an age that, one, she qualified for this, and number two, she spoke Czech and German both. So she was valuable to them, and she spoke perfect Czech and German. So when she was brought into Block 31, which was the place where the Germans showed the world how wonderful they were treating the children, how wonderful they were treating people in Auschwitz. So it was a front. But that allowed Vita to come and help and saved her life in some ways where she wouldn't have experienced the harshness of work out in the field every single day. The book tells us that Freddie Hirsch challenged her to be the librarian. And she said, I can't do that, I'm afraid. And he said to her, yes, but when you're afraid and you're trembling, that's when you're the bravest. He said, brave people that are taking a chance, will be more careful than someone who just thinks this is so easy. I know that you will take this job seriously. And so that she takes it on. He describes in the book how at one point the books are chosen by the teachers, and then the children in their school, this is their school, Dita drew this. So the children are sitting on the benches, and the teachers are reading or telling them and giving them lessons. This was a front for the, Hearst told the SS officers, hey, these children won't be running around driving me crazy if we teach them. But in Hirsch's mind, he was preparing this generation of children for, let me go back. He was preparing this generation of children for the next years after Auschwitz. He was believing that these children would make it, that some of them would make it out, and that it was their responsibility to prepare the next generation so that they would have their faith, they would have understanding of the ruler of the world, they had an atlas, they had H.G. Wells' book of the history of the world, they had geometry, they had, what else did they have? A book on Freud. In fact, he told Dita, he said, oh, this book is no good. It's too advanced and it's not right for the children in this situation. And Dita said to him, how can you say that? After all we've seen, after all we've been through, you think this book is horrible? She said, this book is nothing compared to what we've already seen in our lives. At my young age, at 14, this is nothing compared to what I've had experienced. So she challenged him on that book because she knew that she'd already read so much. She came from a family that loved books. books. Hirsch also thought that this was going to be a living library that she was distributing. Not just the books, but the teachers were going to carry those books. And then when the SS officers came in, they would hide them. And it was her responsibility to try to get all the books, collect them, and hide them before the SS officers. And so one time, Iturbe just has her take the books and put them under her smock and hold them very carefully. And SS officers are looking for stuff. And she's terrified, and so she's beginning to think of other things besides the books, and her arms are getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And she just, she's trying to think of other things. And then Jose Mangel comes in, and he's whistling this song, which is a song that Bach wrote. And she said, of all things, I knew the song. And she said, I could not believe it. So while I was struggling to hold the books, I was concentrating on the music. It was horrible to have that music used in his, he would whistle it all the time. And it just got kind of ingrained in her head in this book, in the writing of the book. Somehow that day when the SS officers are coming in, they come to her and she's frightened. But there's a gentleman who looks a little bit rough around the edges, a little bit like a dumb, kind of slow and dumb. And he is a professor, but he looks less than intelligent and smart. But he's intelligent and smart enough to get the attention of the SS officers, trip over something, and cause a calamity where she is not found to have the books. Hirsch knows that he did it on purpose. Dita knows that he just saved her life. And over and over again, this gentleman did the same thing. He was so smart, he could be dumb. So there are lots of vignettes in this book about life, about people. It talks about relationships and people that she meets in Auschwitz. It tells their stories. It talks about the conversations. It talks about their food. It talks about how when Dita's mother is sick, Dita can't go into the hospital and talk to her mother. She must go to the window and stand back by the window and just say, hey, Mama, Dad, Father died. She couldn't go inside because her mother was sick. So she stood outside and said at the side of the window very carefully, Mama, Papa died. I don't know about you, but that would just kill me. So those are the kind of things that are in this book. I would recommend it. It hit me so hard when I first read it. And one of the things that really, thinking about a living library, somebody walking around carrying that book and hiding it before someone else would die. There was another author at the beginning of this book, and I loved his statement. He says, he's talking about literature and books. Javier Marias says, literature has the same impact as a match lit in the middle of the field. In the middle of the night, the match illuminates relatively little, but it enables us to see how much darkness surrounds it. So the books may have only been 8, but it illuminated enough to teach the children what was beyond the darkness and what they could help and be anticipating in the future. So this was some of the children wrapped up in the camp. These kids were probably going to the death camps. These were some of the children, and they're showing their tattoos here, where they have them. And Dita will tell you about that in a few minutes, about the tattoos and her experience. And I'm going to, there's several YouTube presentations on her where she's talking. I chose this one. It was a few years ago when she was 75. She's now 90, but I like the shortness of it, the conciseness of it, the discussion about Auschwitz, and about her life afterwards. So I'm going to start this now. Let's see.
Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. We are in Netanya, Israel today, and my guest is Dita Klaus. Hello.
Hello and shalom.
Shalom. You have survived after being held captive in Auschwitz, among other places, during World War II. We commemorate this month the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and you are known as a librarian of Auschwitz. It was a library with less than 15 books. Can you explain us how did that work and how all this started?
I came there in December of 1943. It was terribly crowded, it was terribly cold, and we were extremely hungry. There was great suffering, and people died. Every day there were dozens of dead people. In Auschwitz there was a part that was called Birkenau, and this consisted of some 6 sections, and one of them was the so-called family camp, where children could stay over day while the adults had to work, all the adults had to work. And I was put there in charge of the few books. There were a few books on the children's block. Nothing else. There was no furniture. The floor was earth. And the books were a collection, a random collection, brought from the ramp where the prisoners sorted the luggage of the rebels. And when they found a book in the luggage, they managed to smuggle it into the children's block. And so there was a collection of books that were not especially for children.
And I told that your parents were also being held captive in Auschwitz, and unfortunately your father died there.
My father didn't survive long. As I said, we were extremely hungry. There was barely food. We got the only cooked food was a soup that contained very little solid pieces, and a piece of bread, and a small cube of margarine. That was the whole food for the day, every day. And my father got thinner and thinner. We arrived in December, and at the beginning of February, my father just couldn't get up from his bunk. He stayed on the bed, and the next night he died.
You learned your dad was dead, unfortunately, and you had to tell it to your mom.
My mother was ill at the time. She was in a separate wing of the hospital for the contagious diseases. I couldn't go in, and I had to tell her. So I went along the wall, a wooden wall, and knocked and called Mama, Mama. And then she heard me, and I told her through the wall that Father died.
When your father died, when people are hunting you for what you are, a young Jewish girl, when you are held captive in such horrific conditions, and when you are the witness of such a barbaric behavior, how do you find this part of humanity in yourself? Did it help you in a way to survive?
This is very difficult to say. I have the feeling that for children, it was less horrible than for the adults. The life of the Jews was already for several years was getting worse and worse. For me, it started when I was 10, 11. So that was the reality of my surroundings. I almost couldn't compare it to normal life at that age.
And you always loved painting, drawing, and for Yad Vashem, you did some drawings. Can you show us what the children's block looked like, please?
I was asked by people who work in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem Memorial, Holocaust Memorial, how did the children's block look inside? We have no photos and no drawings. I tried to depict it here. In the other blocks, it wasn't heated, but the children's block was heated, so that when I sat with my books here, at the end, here it is better, here you can see better. Here it was heated, here they put wood or coal, I can't remember what, something, and the chimney was warm, and I was sitting here with my books, with my back to the chimney. So it was nice and warm there.
You saw many friends die in Auschwitz, and of course your dad. But one young man survived. His name was Otto Kraus. You met him in the worst place in the world, but after the war, you found him and you got married.
After 15 months, U.S. Attorney John.
There you go. Thank you. So, it kind of introduced me to the end, to a different part of her life now. So she did get out of Auschwitz. She did get sent to another camp, and then they were liberated. She did meet a gentleman, and let me read it to you what happened here. Let me just find it. So she says that her father had died and her mother had died, and that she went back to Prague June 27th, 1945. Her mother had died just after that. So she was sent back to Prague as an orphan. She said she had no home. She had a few pieces of clothing and tied in a blanket and a few packs of cigarettes. She says, I was almost the only survivor of my family. And then she went to live with a friend. And she says, how do you explain your survival for 2.5 years in the ghetto concentration camp and then extermination? She says, probably a good constitution, luck, and again luck. I think God's looking over her. But after a few days of being in the city, they would have to stand in line with their ID cards and try to get food and other things. And she happened to meet a gentleman, Otto Kraus, as she stood in line with her ID. She recognized him as one of the instructors from the children's block. But they had never spoken in the children's block, she said. She didn't remember him. So then, in the following months, Tina found a home with her friend Marguerite in the spa town of Tepes. Otto wrote her every day. And after a year, he said, why don't you come to Prague? I can't love you from a distance. And they were married in 1947. So Otto Kraus, he wrote a book. The first book was called The Painted Wall. It's not a publication. It was done in 1994. Otto died in 2000, but they have republished his book under the children's block and by some other authors, and it was published in 2019. So it too is available. Otto and Dita moved to Israel in 1949, and they were in a kibbutz for several years. Otto was an English teacher, and Dita worked in a shoe repair shop, and she taught in Hasidic schools and things like that. She wanted people to know that books were always a part of her life, and that she still tells people the importance of books. Just recently, Dita wrote a book called A Delayed Life, and I have that here. A Delayed Life, the true story of the librarian of Auschwitz. And it takes you through different parts of the book, part 1, part 2, part 3. And she called it a delayed life because she felt like as a child her life was taken away from her. And it took her quite a few years before she really got over Auschwitz, where she could really start living again. I will say it was an interesting book. It's not as exciting as The Librarian of Auschwitz. It's a little bit tamer, a little bit less exciting to read, but it is very historical. So if you want to know about her real life and how she thought about her life, read it. You will enjoy it. It is nonfiction, where this is historical fiction. This is about like a certain point of time, like 3 or 4 months, a year. This spans her whole life. And it goes all the way to the end. And she often says in her discussions, she'll say, my life was delayed for many years because I hadn't gotten over what happened. I kept waiting for other things to happen. And then all of a sudden I decided that I needed to stop delaying my life, waiting for something else to happen. I just needed to live it again. And she thought that that happened to a lot of people, that it took them years to where they really felt like they were living again. I want to thank you for being part of this, this book, Zoom for Lunch. And I just want to reiterate that it is a really good book. I know she wasn't thrilled with all of the discussions in the historical fiction book, but I do want you to know that I've read The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and I've read a couple other books on Auschwitz, and the cruelty and the difficulty in the camp was probably well written about. Whether she experienced every single thing that he wrote about, I don't know, but you can certainly get a vision of how difficult it was. The other thing that inspired me is, as a librarian, books and literature and things like this are so important to be shared in our world, that if we get rid of our materials from the past, we won't have anything to point to for our future. We must keep the past, the present, and look to the future as we enjoy literature and as we write. And that's part of my heart for being a librarian, is to make sure that people in our community have the materials they need to be good citizens, to understand what the foundations of our country is, what the foundations, what is happening in the world, that we never forget that not only the horrors, but we remember all of the good things too. So I recommend this to you, and I say I hope your lunch was good, and that you will check that out from the library.